So I hope everyone was able to find that picture, whether you took a screenshot or found it on the announcements page. But it's that picture of the waves, lots of tiny little waves. I don't think, uh, excuse me, a sketch here isn't going to be too important. I set up the composition in this way where the dry sand, meaning the wet sand down here, is really just like this bottom corner. And we could use some masking fluid here down for that white foam of the water. But again, just like we said about the whites of the eyes, that white foam is not actually white. There's a couple highlights within it, but for the most part, it's like a warm gray. Could use masking fluid. I don't know if it's totally necessary. I'm just gonna be careful. I think because again, it's not actually white, but even the dry sand along here has a pretty sharp edge to it. So I'm just going to be careful with that. But I drew a couple of lines for that. We could draw a couple of lines across the top here, but I don't think it's totally necessary. What I like about painting the ocean, and I think what we should think about while we're painting it today, this week, is we don't have to paint every single piece of every single wave. What we want to do is look at the pattern of the whole thing, like the whole emergent pattern, and try and translate that into a painting that I don't know, we find compelling and interesting, however we want to arrange those shapes. So what I'm interested in here is, again, the light and shadow shape and how those two link together, but also the temperature relationships. There's like a really cool to warm gradient kind of underlying the whole thing. And then there's a cool to warm within each of those, just like we do with light and shadow shape. So the more we look, the more we'll see. And anytime I'm painting the ocean like this, I'm always thinking like there's going to be like some larger underlying waves with like medium-sized waves on top of that, and then smaller size waves on top of that. And we'll kind of build it from the ground up. Painting water like this is tricky because it's reflective, it's transparent, and it can be opaque all at once. So this is also, it's a good exercise in just abstracting what you're seeing and just thinking of it as an arrangement of shapes and colors. More so than like this is one distinct wave here and this is another distinct wave here. It's all mixing together, which makes it really hard to paint. So sorry in advance for another very challenging painting project with very little time, but I think it'll help. What I like about this image, usually when I paint the ocean, there's a clear horizon. This is just water going all the way off the top of the page, which I think will be cool. Does anyone know the work of Via Selmans? One of my favorite art. I'll bring up her work real quick here. She does these giant drawings. Let me share my screen. Giant drawings of the surface of the ocean. So she's definitely an inspiration for this one we're about to do. But they're executed really well, but I think they're also a cool statement on, you know, what it is we're doing when we draw or paint something representational like this or from a photo and our relationship to the photograph. So she's drawing these oceans without any real focal point.
She painted this?
Yeah, this is a drawing.
A drawing.
Yeah,
Okay. Graphite?
I think so.
Does this person,
Go ahead.
What was that? Is this what?
person display at the Laguna Festival or one of them? Maybe the,
I don't think so. She's like a heavy hitter. She's in museums. Her work is very expensive. She's at the Tate here. She's at the Met. I don't think she's at the Laguna Festival. She also does these spider webs, the night sky. So this is a drawing of the night sky. And these are all absolutely accurate to whatever it is that she's really committing herself to that kind of image. Here's the surface of the moon, I think. She has a lot of the drawings and paintings of the surface of the moon. One of my favorite artists, for sure. Then just these random, like really nice still life paintings. So
Do you know when they do there's a big award competition for portraiture every year. And I don't know if you showed it to us or somebody showed it to us. And this one was in New York, I think. And the actual most detailed and realistic were the people who did it in graphite. I was just blown away with what they could do.
yeah, graphite is good for slow and methodical and accurate. I think there's more room to spend more time.
Whenever I'm going to do a relative and I work it out first in graphite and I do all my shadowing sort of like an illustrator on one side with just a vertical shadowing. It turns out so much better than when I try to paint it. I really seem to grab it at the graphite stage. So
Yeah.
sometimes, the color distorts what's going on.
Yeah, I think there's more control too, compared to like, especially what we're doing now with the brushes and the water versus, the tip of this pencil is pretty specific. So we can be pretty clear about what it is that we want. Right now, I'm just wetting the paper. So again, we could soak the paper. You could run it under the tap in the sink. Maybe I'll do a demo of that next week since we talked about it today. But I'm just getting this whole thing wet, except for this little piece down here. I'm going to try and preserve that dry sand right there. It's not necessarily the white of the paper, but it's definitely going to be a drier edge, sharper edge along there too, where it runs into the wet sand. But my plan here is to get this gradient going from warm to cool, with like going from warm yellow to green to blue in the background. So I'm painting, if we look at the photo, what I'm looking at here is not necessarily these shadows on the surface. If we could imagine this without all the complexity we're seeing on the surface and just trying to get similar to what we did with the flower, the way this is glowing a little bit more as it moves away from us, we see less of the ground reflecting the light. So what we're seeing right here is clear water over the wet sand, which is pretty warm. As the water gets deeper, we're seeing more and more of the water itself, less and less of the light reflecting off of the ground. And then that just kind of goes away as it gets deeper, which is, I think, what's interesting about it for a lot of reasons, but even the colors themselves, pretty interesting. Okay, so before this dries, sorry, I wet my paper and then started talking and then it's gonna dry on me. I'm gonna start off. I'm gonna say some yellow ochre. Pour out some more. Excuse me. So even within the yellows, we're going to go from warm to cool. I'm starting out with more yellow ochre. Then I think as we get more green, we're seeing it's more green kind of on the surface. So I feel like, yeah. Sorry, I'm just making a plan in my head here. I'm thinking it's going to go from yellow ochre to a light ultramarine blue. So I don't want to be too heavy handed here, but I don't want to leave it too light. When I look at this and squint, the darkest area is really like right here. Because we get lighter as we get closer to the horizon up here, we get lighter as we get closer to the sand down here. Try and preserve some of these light shapes here that I said I would be careful about, and then just paint it right over. Then up here, I'm going to add some ultramarine blue. I think cerulean could work too. Maybe I'll do a mix of the two. My two blues. And I just want like a nice smooth gradient. Even if we think all the way back to when we did that color chart. Think about how smooth of a gradient can you get going from one color to the other? How seamless can you make that? I'm gonna go grab that hair dryer just because we are short on time right now. I'm gonna try and speed up the process here. I'll be right back. All right, so I'm gonna use this hair dryer. I'm gonna mute my Okay, so this is pretty light and pretty thin. And this is going to serve as my foundation for the painting. What I'm after here, I'm going to share my screen one more time looking at this photo. Just like what we were talking about earlier today, it's going to be this separation of light and shadow. Excuse me. Let me put this in Photoshop real quick just to show you how distinct those can be. So if I look at this shadow shape in here, it's like this dark, kind of warmish green. Putting that right next to this light shape right here, you can see how similar there if I zoom way out here. And this is just in this smaller zone where I sampled those from. The light and shadow shape are close in value, little different in temperature. This is like a cooler, darker green. This one is much warmer, a little bit more saturated. So they're really close in value, really close in temperature. What's distinct are the shapes from each other. They're not too sharp, but they're pretty distinct going from one shape to the next. So we can get really close up, really zoomed in. As long as we have the right colors mixed up, we can map out that light and shadow pattern in a really clear way. And then as we move up, as we move out towards the horizon, they get further and further separated. So let's see this one here, a little bit darker. And then if we put that up against its light shape here, that blue is getting brighter. And then again, further out over here, let's look at this shadow shape here. Everything's getting more and more blue as we move away from that reflected sand color. Finally, we've got that lighter blue up here. So if we think of these three groups, I could even post this on Canvas just so everyone can see it. I'm thinking of these as like distinct little pairs. Obviously, there are steps between these two, but if we can understand the difference between the light and the shadow, how similar they can be value-wise and temperature-wise, the contrast that we're seeing is from one shape to the next and balancing the sharper edges against the softer ones. So if you want to take a screenshot of this, I'll take one now and I'll remember to post it later. The shapes of the water, excuse me, are pretty much the same. They're all doing pretty similar things. They get a little bit more stacked as the horizon gets further away. They get a little bit more foreshortened. We're looking out at these. We're kind of looking straight down at these ones. So there is that little bit of space in the perspective is implied there. But other than that, all of those shapes are doing really similar things with just balancing those harder and softer edges. The difference in the color is there's less contrast here. This is warmer and more saturated and darker. There's less contrast here. A little more value contrast here, but less difference in temperature. Does that make sense? These are kind of more blue. Not necessarily monochromatic. There's still definitely some green in the shadow there, but both the light and the shadow are getting lighter and more blue as it gets out and further away. So I'm gonna keep that in mind as I'm mixing my colors. It's really easy to get really close up and focused on each individual shape. I want you to try your hardest to keep an eye on the big picture.
what colors are you using for the blue?
For the blue, yeah, back here we can start off with, I'll kind of work back to front. I'm gonna start off with some cerulean, maybe a tiny bit of raw umber to like desaturate a little bit, just to like knock it back and cool it off. Not cool it off. Add that tiny little, there's like a little bit of a tinge of green in there. And this is looking at the light shape up here. And then the slightly darker version of that would be something similar. I can use cerulean again. Maybe I'll use a little bit of yellow ochre, maybe some
Shan,
ultramarine blue. Yes.
what green did you use? What kind?
I used that first one was cerulean with raw umber.
Mhm.
This second one is cerulean with a little bit of ultramarine to darken it and a little bit of yellow ochre to push it a little bit more green. And those two are going to be that like first pair up here.
Mhm. Thank you.
So this is a little wet still. I might use the hair dryer again just to dry this off. So it's just kind of damp, not necessarily dry. Because if we look close at all those little shapes, um, it's a good mix of like soft and firm edges and a couple of sharp edges here and there. I might mix in just the tiniest bit of cadmium yellow into this like darker greenish, dull cerulean green mix. And you could think about all those things we were talking about today as far as painting what the shape and the form is doing as much as what it looks like. I'm not copying every little thing I see, but I'm trying to capture the movement overall. I kind of see like in the big picture, they're a little bit more horizontal up here and they kind of get bigger and radiate out sort of in like this direction, if that makes sense. So I'm going to keep that in mind with every little mark that I'm making here. And like we were saying with those flower petals, like as loose and expressive as we want to be in this stage, once these shapes are down, excuse me, especially up here where there's a little bit more contrast in the values, once these shapes are down, I'm kind of committed to them. Down here, it might be a little bit looser. But I'm like, I'm looking at the photo and using it, but I'm also just putting these brush strokes where they feel like they should go, where I feel like they should go. Once they're down, I'm gonna commit to that because I might, if I come back, or if I were to come back and revisit this more than once, I'm not gonna change my mind and put a different shadow shape in a different spot. So I hope that makes sense. I feel like I say that every other minute. I'm like, does that make sense? So sorry for being so repetitive. It's hard when I can't see everyone in front of me. If I when I'm in the classroom, if I say something, everyone's body language tells me that didn't make any sense, and then I know to explain it better. So forgive me for being repetitive, if that makes sense. See, up here towards this corner, the brushstrokes are getting much smaller. That perspective, the foreshortening of like the surface of the water as one big unified plane, that whole thing is getting foreshortened. So I could even get a smaller brush. Even this last corner up here, it still matters. For me to show that perspective. I keep like remixing my pigments over here, even as they sit in their little pool, they still tend to separate a little bit, which could be cool. It could be interesting in the painting, but I wonder what causes that if some pigments separate more than others. One thing about this painting that I'm seeing almost none of is the color red. That doesn't mean we can't put any red in here, but just keep in mind if the red is calling your name for one reason or another, be really thoughtful about where that's going because it's going to jump out so strong.
Don't you think the red is in the pinkiness of the sand?
Yeah, down here, I think there could be like a little bit of like maybe some of that quinacridone magenta or something, like almost in some of these grays where the
Mhm.
white bubbles are
Mhm.
mixing with the like gray
Yeah.
reflections.
In order to get that soft sandy color, I had to mix my opera rose with the blue and a touch of yellow ochre. But
Yeah.
it's really elusive.
Yeah.
Jane,
wondering.
if
Oh,
I have,
sorry, go ahead.
are you gonna tape the rest of this, or I have to go in a minute, but are you gonna finish it, or?
I don't know if I'll finish it because I have to be done close to 12 today.
Cause it's, yeah,
It's
Are
which
you-
is kind of right now.
you re-wet as you go down?
Sorry, what was that?
You re-administer water as you go down? You know, in other words, if it
Um,
dries,
Yeah, I'm gonna add excuse me. Going back to this one, I might remix like this lighter color right here as I get into this middle zone. Maybe I can try that right now. I'm gonna use a flat brush for this. Back to that lighter blue mix there. So what's tricky about this is the shadows up here start to become light shapes for here, and then the light shapes here start to get closer to the shadows on here. So they kind of follow each other. So if you look at my palette right now, I'm taking some of what I had for the shadow colors up here, mixing it into a little bit of cerulean. And I don't want it to be too like stripy. I know I broke it up into like 3 basic zones, but just for the sake of working on one area at a time, I'm just pushing this. I could even kind of bring this up and glaze it into what I had a little bit, but so again, remember the light shape here is also getting darker and warmer as we go from top to bottom. And then from there, now I can start, I'll mix another kind that's a little bit darker and definitely more saturated towards green. I'm going to use more cad yellow in addition to ultramarine and yellow ochre. For this middle green here. I'm kind of skipping ahead just for the demo, but and I would, if I had more time here, I would kind of revisit this and repaint the newer layers onto this. And each time I pass through, focusing on being more and more clear about like which shapes I kind of like more, which ones I'm repainting. This is still a little bit wet here that I'm getting into the surface. I think it's okay for now.
I'm sorry, but I have to go as well, pick up a granddaughter. But I enjoyed it and I kept painting through all the discussion, and I'll share when I get done. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Jane. Yeah, if anyone has to go, we are at 12 o'clock here. I myself have to go soon as well, but I just wanted to show you where I would go with this. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but we're getting a little bit darker, more green. I'm like punching up some of these shapes above and then getting further below. I'm gonna get darker and more of a warm, kind of passing, kind of almost leaving green behind, getting more towards like a yellow ochre, raw umber. So I don't recommend painting this quickly, moving through it at the speed that I am. Take your time, build this up slowly. And just notice those differences going from warm to cool, light to dark. Both of those are kind of changing as they go further and further away. And keep in mind, like what we've said this semester about like drawing or painting leaves on a tree or the flower petals, anything in nature like this, it's easy to get repetitive brushstrokes. So think about how you can vary up that texture with different kinds of marks. Maybe it's switching your brush, maybe it's from standing a little bit further away. Keep an eye on the big picture and trying to maintain that gesture. Like this whole body of water has small, medium, and large chunky little waves going back in space. It's not just a flat, totally flat surface with all the same wave across the top. There is some more movement underneath. Especially as it gets closer, it gets more in focus, kind of in this zone right here. I think what I'm doing right here is capturing a lot of the larger shapes. And then as I look closer, I just see more and more in there. Kind of does remind me of the night sky, which also reminds me of the Via Selman's work. But you know, as your eyes adjust when you're looking at the stars, you end up just seeing more and more stars. You see smaller ones that might be further away, and you see smaller and smaller clusters. So similarly, when we're looking at the water here, we see into it smaller and smaller, but also more subtle pieces. I guess what's counterintuitive about this one is there's more contrast further away. And as things get closer and more in focus, there's less contrast. So that's extra tricky. So now that we're closer down here, I'm really pushing the yellow. And I can glaze over this later with a transparent layer to get the blues next to it. Another thing to keep in mind here as we're working on this, just for the whole week, is that everything is leading into the next thing. Nothing is isolated really on its own. That's what makes it challenging, but also what I think makes it interesting is that there's really nothing is separate in here. It's all connected and fluid. So I'm gonna use the hairdryer to dry this out a tiny bit, but not completely. And then I'm gonna drag some blue across the top. So I'm gonna mute this real quick. Use some more of my desaturated cerulean here. I'll use some ultramarine too. So some of my blues and then that raw umber giving me this dull blue-green color. I'm gonna add some more water. So I'm losing a lot of those shapes that I just created. That's okay. I can go back and rebuild those again. Oops. But that was sort of like, it was like a transparent layer of that blue-green across a not totally dry, kind of damp passage of all of those larger shapes that I had done in that way more saturated yellow. And then I can continue pulling this down to meet some of this darker brown. And then finally there's that lighter beige color of the dry sand. So I might actually use, I lied when I said there's no red. I'm gonna use some of that, some burnt sienna and maybe a little bit alizarin crimson mixed in with that for this darker wet sand down here. Can desaturate that with a little bit of blue. This is pretty dry right here, so I'm going to use that to create that sharper edge of the white water there. Push this a lot darker, I think. So this is burnt sienna, some alizarin crimson, and then a little bit of ultramarine blue. I'm going to take this clean brush and just soften these edges right here. Or I can always go back and carve out some sharper shadows in here where those bubbles are kind of resting on top of the wet sand there. The color for down here is kind of an outlier, so I'm going to clean off my palette to mix that. Just kind of a dull, random, neutral color. I'm going to use a little bit of that magenta mixed in with this yellow ochre and just lots of water because it's so bright. Leave enough room here for all of this in between zone. But I can repeat that process a few times over. Again, I know this is really sped up. Some of my marks are really careless, but I've got some shapes laid out here that I can commit to, and I can just take like the movements of the shapes and then translate them into what I have here on my page. It's not so much about like, okay, now I'm going to get more true to the photo. I'm just going to keep developing what I have here and use like the pattern, the movement of all those shapes. That's what I'm after. That's what I want to express here. So I can take that and then take what I see in the photo and apply it to what has ended up here on my page. Which can go for any painting really, but especially this one. Again, I recommend working on this in like bigger chunks. I don't want to just paint one area and then walk away. Like I'm going to address this whole zone that has really similar colors. I'm going to adjust this all at once since nothing here is isolated. So I don't want to paint anything as if it's there on its own. It can be hard to match a color perfectly. Run the risk of overworking stuff, trying to match stuff. So working on this in one swift pass, not the whole painting, but just these larger pieces of it. I'm gonna get rid of that glare. That's different. So I don't knit, but I mean, I'd like to. I think knitting's really cool. I think this painting feels like we're knitting. Just one little brush stroke at a time. Paying attention, but also just kind of I don't know, I'm pretty relaxed painting this. And I hope you are too. I hope it's not too anxious. But just kind of going from one section to the next. Maybe adding more or less blue, more or less yellow, keeping those values and temperatures balanced. Try not to have too much of the same brushstroke over and over again. Think about that movement. And if you deviate from the photo, that's totally fine. No one's ever going to know that. And even if they did, the point of this whole thing, this whole semester, not just to copy a photo, but to use a photo to make a painting.
Shane, we're painting the shadow side of the wave, each wave, and leaving what's underneath as the highlight part,
Right. Yeah, the
basically.
light shape underneath is the
Yeah.
lighter and more of a cooler blue. And if that's too much, if the white of the paper is coming through too much, you can do what I've done a few times already is let it dry, or at least let it kind of dry. And then I did like a wash over it to kind of push back those light shapes and darken them a little bit. Because remember, like if we look especially up here, if you look at the photo, squint your eyes, the light shapes are really dark and the dark shapes are pretty light. And then once we get in here, there's almost no difference value-wise. Let's look in Photoshop again real quick at this in black and white. These values are very similar. Excuse me. So when we're painting these, the real difference is going to be temperature more than value. So just keep that in mind. If it feels like the light shapes in here are too light, you can always pass over it with a glaze. I'm using this like really rough looking bristle brush as this is drying just to move the pigment around, give it a little bit of texture and movement. You can see that little bit of scratchiness getting pulled in different directions there. I guess the real lesson here is local value and local color versus the more general value and the more general color, meaning like the difference between light and shadow right here is a lot different than it is right here, and it's different up here. So they're changing as they move away from us. Those bigger gradients are at the heart of how I go about painting ocean water like this. So glazing over that again, I'm darkening the light shapes again, which gives me room then to darken the shadows another time.
Shane, what brand of watercolor you usually use?
I have Winsor Newton paint. It
Winsor-
looks like this.
Okay, okay. And when you use like cat red or do you use light or medium?
I usually go for medium, just because that seemed like a good one to choose at the store. That's kind of where that how that got started. Now that's just what I use mostly.
Okay. Have you ever painted with Da Vinci?
No, I haven't. I keep hearing about it. I keep wanting to try it. I know they're local. I've heard good things from students about them.
I wonder if sometimes they they have the same name, but then the pigments are different. Like cadmium, if I get cadmium red from Da Vinci, I'm not sure if it's going to be the same as cadmium red from Winsor.
Right. It might be different. Yeah. We noticed that a bit in the beginning of the semester. We did that color chart project, and
Right.
even within your own pigments, you might find differences. And doesn't mean one's better than the other. It just they might have different strengths and weaknesses and different uses for different things.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Trying to think of which colors varied the most. It might have been yellow ochre, had a lot of differences. Alrighty.